For 6 months, I drove my daughter's fiancé to work every single morning. And in 6 months, that young man never once looked at my face. I don't mean he was rude. I mean, I was furniture. I'd pull up outside his building at 7:15, and he'd get in the back seat and he'd say, "Morning," to the general direction of the front of the car the way you'd say it to a parking meter, and then he'd spend the next 35 minutes on his phone, and when we got downtown he'd get out and pull the door shut without a word, and I would watch him walk into the lobby of a building with my company's name on it. Because here's the part he didn't know. I own the company he worked for. I own the building. I own the car I was driving him in. I own the parking space he walked past, and the coffee cart in the lobby, and the 22 trucks in the yard that started the whole thing 40 years ago. He had no idea. To Julian, I was a driver. A gray-haired man in a company polo shirt who showed up every morning to take him downtown, beneath his notice, invisible, the kind of person a man like Julian has decided does not require a second look. And I want to tell you why I was doing it, because it matters, and I'll get to all of it. But first I have to tell you about the morning of the 17th of June, because that's the morning everything I thought I knew turned inside out. It was a Wednesday, raining a little. We were on the connector, that stretch of highway between his neighborhood and downtown where the traffic stacks up around 7:30, and we were stopped, and Julian was in the back on the phone, and he thought, the way people think when they've decided the driver is furniture, that he had privacy. He didn't know I could hear every word. People never do. They think the front seat is another country, and he was laughing about something, easy and warm, the way he laughs at Sunday dinner at my daughter's table, and then he lowered his voice a little, and he said a sentence I have not been able to get out of my head for 1 hour since. He said, "No, listen. After the wedding, she has an accident, something clean, and the insurance is $8 million. I want to describe what happened in my body because I've thought about it 100 times. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me later. My foot came off the brake. That's the thing I remember. My foot just came off the brake pedal and the car rolled forward and tapped the bumper of the truck ahead of us, a little nothing tap, and the driver up there threw his hand up in his mirror, and Julian in the back said, 'Jesus, watch it,' annoyed, to the furniture, and went right back to his call. She has an accident. The insurance is $8 million. She, my Nora." I said, "Sorry about that," in the flat voice you use when you're furniture, and I put my foot back on the brake, and I drove my daughter's fiancé the rest of the way downtown while he finished planning how to kill her. And I did not say one word, because in the space of about 4 seconds I had understood something. If I reacted, if I made one sound, if he saw one thing in my eyes in that mirror, then the only advantage I had in the entire world was gone. He thought I was nobody. That was the single most dangerous mistake he could have made, and I was not going to correct it. What I did in the 23 days before that wedding is the reason my daughter is alive, and the reason Julian Rask is going to spend a substantial portion of his life in a cell, and I did not lay one finger on him, and I'm going to tell you all of it. Now I have to stop, because I know what you're bracing for, and it isn't what happened. You're waiting for me to tell you I dragged him out of that back seat, that I'm a big man, or a dangerous one, and that I handled it the way a father wants to handle it. And I'll be honest with you. I am 62 years old. I came up loading trucks. My hands still work. And there was a version of that morning that lived in my chest for about an hour, where I did exactly what you're imagining. I didn't do it. And by the end of this, I think you'll understand that not doing it is the hardest and best thing I have ever done, and that it's the only version where my daughter is actually safe. Because a father who does the satisfying thing goes to jail, and a daughter whose father is in jail is alone with a man who wants her dead. So here's the one thing I'll ask you before I go on. If you have ever been the person nobody in the room looks at, the driver, the cleaner, the older worker, the one people talk in front of because they've decided you don't count, or if you have ever watched somebody treat a nobody like that and felt something go cold in you, then subscribe and stay with me. Because this whole story turns on one thing. My daughter's fiancé destroyed himself. Completely, for one reason, and the reason is that he could not imagine that the man driving his car was a person who mattered. I make these for the people the world decides not to look at. That's the whole channel. Stay, and I'll show you what invisibility is actually worth. All right, let me back all the way up. My name is Emmett Boswell. I'm 62 years old. I started driving a truck when I was 20 in 1983 for a freight outfit that went under 2 years later. When it folded, I had a commercial license, $4,000, and a used cab over that I bought at the auction of the company that had just fired me, and I started hauling on my own. One truck. Me. By 1991, I had 6 trucks and a name, Cardinal Freight Lines, and by the time I was 50, I had 110 trucks, 3 warehouses, a logistics arm, and about 400 employees, and I want to tell you the thing I'm proudest of, and it isn't the number. It's that I still know how to back a 53-foot trailer into a dock in one pull, and that every driver who works for me knows I can, and knows I did it for a living, and knows that when I walk through the yard, I know their names, and I know what the job actually costs a body, because I paid it. I never stopped driving. That's the piece you need. I'm not a man who dressed up as a driver to spy on somebody. I'm a driver who happened to build a company. When I get in the front seat of one of our cars, that's not a costume. That's the most comfortable I ever am. My daughter is Nora. She's 29. She's the only child I've got, and her mother and I divorced when Nora was 14. Amicably enough, Leanne's remarried and lives in Arizona, and we're fine. And Nora and I raised each other, more or less, from her teens on. She's an architect. She designs the insides of hospitals, the parts that are supposed to make a terrible day slightly less frightening, the way a hallway curves so you can see the nurse's station from the waiting room. She thinks about people she'll never meet. That's who she is. And 2 years ago, she brought home a man named Julian Rask. I liked him at first. I have to be honest about that because the whole point of this is that these men are likable, and if I paint him as an obvious snake from the first handshake, then I'm lying to you, and I'm making it too easy. Julian was charming. He was good-looking in a clean catalog sort of way, and he had a good job. He was a financial analyst at a firm downtown, and he was attentive to Nora in the ways that show. He remembered the anniversary of the day they met. He brought her mother flowers when Leanne visited. He could talk to anybody about anything for exactly as long as that person was useful to the conversation. That last part I only understood later. Here's the first thing I noticed, and I want you to hear how small it was, because you have somebody like this in your life, and you've explained it away too. We went to dinner, the 3 of us, about a year ago, to celebrate the engagement. Nice place. And the young man who brought our water was maybe 19, nervous, new, and he spilled a little water setting down Julian's glass. Not on Julian, just on the table. And he apologized, and Julian smiled at him, a big warm smile, and said, "It's fine, don't worry about it." And the kid went away relieved. And then Julian turned back to us and, still smiling, said, "They really will hire anyone here, huh?" in a light little voice, and Nora laughed, and I did not. Because I had just watched a man be kind to someone's face and contemptuous of them the second they turned around, and do it so smoothly that the woman he loved laughed, and I thought, I need to watch this one. It wasn't the contempt exactly. Everybody's got some. It was the seam, how perfectly the warm face and the cold face fit together. No gap between them, like a man who'd practiced. A kind face for people who could see him, a cold one the instant they couldn't. And it made me wonder, in a way I couldn't shake, which face my daughter was getting. That's the thing I do. I've hired 400 people and fired a fair number, and if you want to know a man, you don't watch how he treats his boss or his girlfriend's father. Everybody's on their best behavior uphill. You watch how he treats the people who can do nothing for him. The waiter, the guy who fuels the trucks, the driver, especially the driver. And that is the actual reason, I'll tell you now, because I said I would, that I started driving Julian Rask to work. When Nora told me they were engaged, I didn't do what a man in my position could have done, which is have Julian summoned to my office on the top floor and reveal myself as the owner of the building and look him over across a big desk. Because that Julian, the one who knows he's talking to Nora's rich father, that Julian would have been magnificent. Polished. Perfect. I'd have learned nothing. I wanted to meet the other one. The one who comes out when a man thinks nobody who matters is watching. So I did something a little crazy, and Nora doesn't know I did it, and I'll have to tell her eventually. Our company runs a small executive car service. we shuttle some of our own downtown staff, a perk. And I quietly put myself on the schedule as the morning driver for the route that picked up Julian's building. And I told the dispatcher to keep my name off it. And for 6 months, 3 or 4 mornings a week, I drove my daughter's fiancé downtown and said, "Morning," and watched him in the mirror and waited to find out who he was. I told myself I was being overprotective, a paranoid old man. I told myself I'd feel foolish in a few months when he turned out to be fine. I did not turn out to feel foolish. For 6 months, I got an education in Julian Rask, and it came in through the mirror, one morning at a time. He was on the phone constantly, and because I was furniture, he did not modulate. I learned things a father is not supposed to learn about the man his daughter is marrying. I learned he had money problems. Real ones. The kind with a specific menace in the voice on the other end. He'd say things like, "I told you, after July it's handled," and the timeline moves in July. And I thought at the time that July meant the wedding, meant the joining of households, meant he expected to be more comfortable once he was married to an architect with a good salary, and, though he pretended not to have noticed, a father who'd done well. I didn't yet know what "after July" actually meant. I know now. It's the worst sentence in this whole story, and I drove past it a dozen times without hearing it. I learned he talked to one person more than anyone else, a woman. He never said her name in a way I caught early, but the register was different with her. Not the warm catalog voice he used with clients, not the flat voice he used with me. Something underneath both. I told myself it was a work friend. I'm an old man, I told myself. Not everything is sinister. I learned he was cruel about Nora in a specific way that I filed and could not forgive. Once, this was maybe 4 months in, he was on the phone laughing, and he said about my daughter, "No, she's perfect, that's the thing, she's exactly what it needs to look like." And whoever was on the other end said something, and he laughed again and said, "Trust me, nobody looks twice at a guy whose wife is that nice. Exactly what it needs to look like." I heard that, and I gripped the wheel, and I thought I understood it. I thought he meant he was using her socially, that she was arm candy for his ambitions, that my brilliant daughter was, to this man, a prop. And that was enough to make me hate him. I started, quietly, that month, looking into Julian Rask. Where his money went, who he really was. I did not yet understand that exactly what it needs to look like was not about ambition. It was about a widower. About how a grieving young husband, whose lovely wife died in a tragic accident, is exactly the last person anyone suspects, precisely because she was so nice, and he was so devoted, and they were so perfect together. He wasn't telling that woman my daughter would make a good prop for his career. He was telling her she'd make a good prop for a funeral. I want to stop and say something to anybody watching who is doing what I did, explaining the small cruel things away, one at a time, because the big explanation is too big to hold. I heard almost all of it. Months before the 17th of June. The money panic, the secret woman, exactly what it needs to look like. After July, it's handled. I heard every piece, and I assembled them into the second worst story instead of the worst one, because the worst one was unthinkable, and the mind protects you from the unthinkable by handing you something merely awful to worry about instead. The signs are almost never hidden. That's what nobody tells you. They're right there, in the mirror, every morning. The problem is never that you can't see them. The problem is that the true explanation is so monstrous that your mind keeps swapping it for a smaller one you can survive. Until one Wednesday, it can't swap anymore. So now you know what I was carrying when I heard it clean. After the wedding, she has an accident, something clean, and the insurance is $8 million. Every fragment I'd been misfiling for months snapped into one shape in about a second, the way iron filings jump when you finally bring the magnet close. The money panic? After July, it's handled. The secret woman. Exactly what it needs to look like. It wasn't ambition. It had never been ambition. It was a plan, and it had a date, and the date was my daughter's wedding, and the number was $8 million. I drove him downtown. I want you to sit with that because I've had to. I drove the man planning my daughter's murder to his office, and I said, "Have a good one," to the mirror, and he got out and shut the door and didn't say thank you, and I watched him walk into the lobby of my building, And then I pulled around the corner and I put the car in park and I sat there and I did not fall apart, and I have never been more frightened by my own calm. Here's what I did in the first hour, and it's the most important hour, so I'm going to be exact. I did not call Nora. Understand why? If I called my daughter and said, "Julian is planning to kill you," one of two things happens. She doesn't believe me, because she loves him, and because I'm her overprotective father, and because it's insane. And she goes to him, hurt and confused, and says, "My dad thinks you're going to murder me." And now Julian knows he's been heard, and Julian is a man with a plan and a timeline and 8 million reasons, and a cornered man moves his timeline up. Or she does believe me, and she's terrified, and terror makes people do unpredictable things, and I could not control what a terrified person might do, and I needed control. I did not call the police and scream, because what did I have? A father says he overheard his daughter's fiancé, whom he happens to dislike, say something on the phone. There's no recording. It's my word. A patrol officer writes it down and it goes nowhere, and Julian never even knows. Except now I've started a clock without any way to finish it. What I had, the only thing I had, was that Julian did not know who I was. He was going to keep getting in my car. He was going to keep talking because to him I was furniture, and furniture had never once been a risk. Every morning he was going to hand me more, for free, because his entire plan rested on a foundational belief that the people beneath his notice could not hurt him. And I owned the car, I owned the company, I owned the phone he'd been issued and the email account with our name on it, and the monitoring policy he signed on his first day without reading, the same way he'd have his wife sign an insurance form without reading. The invisible man he'd been talking in front of for 6 months was the one person on Earth positioned to end him. So I didn't fall apart in that car. I made a list. And then I drove home, and I made 2 phone calls, and neither one of them was loud, and both of them were to people whose entire profession is making sure that men like Julian Rask are stopped the right way, the way that holds, the way that lasts, the way he doesn't walk on a technicality because a furious father cut a corner. Here's the thing that made Detective Salazar believe me in the first 10 minutes, when he could easily have written me off as an overwrought father. I told him the exact wording. After the wedding, she has an accident, something clean, and the insurance is 8 million. And Salazar was quiet. And then he asked me one question. He said, "Did he say something clean?" And I said yes. And Salazar said, "Emmett, an angry man on the phone, says, I could kill her. A man venting says she'd be better off dead. Those are feelings. Something clean is not a feeling. Something clean is a specification. That's a man who has already thought about the difference between a death that gets investigated and a death that doesn't. People don't talk like that unless they've been living inside the idea for a while. That's when I went cold all the way through, because a professional had just told me that the 2 words I'd have overlooked were the 2 words that proved it was real. Not 8 million. Money is a motive, and motives are cheap. Something clean. The craftsmanship in it. The evidence that my daughter's fiancé had been quietly at work on this like a problem to be solved. I have thought a great deal since about how close I came to focusing on the wrong words. The first call was to my lawyer. The second was to a homicide detective named Hector Salazar, who had retired off the city force 2 years ago and did consulting now, and who had once, a long time ago, ridden in the passenger seat of one of my trucks for a ride-along when he was a young cop and I was a younger man, and who remembered me, and who answered the phone, and who listened to the whole thing without interrupting once. And at the end, Hector Salazar said one sentence that told me I'd called the right man. He said, "Emmett, don't change a single thing about tomorrow morning. Pick him up at 7:15 like always. I'll tell you exactly what to do." I need to explain the lawful part, because it's the whole engine, and because somebody watching this is going to be in a situation where knowing it matters. You cannot, in most places, secretly record a private phone call that you are not part of. If I'd hidden a recorder to catch Julian's calls, I'd have been the one breaking the law, and worse, I'd have handed his lawyer the gift of getting all of it thrown out. The evidence that puts a man like Julian away has to be clean, or it's worse than nothing. But here is what is lawful, and here is what Julian never understood, because understanding it would have required him to see me. That car was a company vehicle. Our fleet cars carry cameras and audio recorders. It's on a sticker on the window, the little one nobody reads. This vehicle may be monitored for safety and quality. Every one of our passengers is notified. Julian had ridden past that sticker 200 times. He'd consented to it the way you consent to everything, by getting in and not caring, because the notice is for furniture and he was not furniture, he was Julian. The recordings from that car belonged to the company, and I owned the company. His work phone was ours. His email, the account he was careless in because he thought of it as his, was on our domain, governed by an acceptable use and monitoring policy he'd signed on day one, the standard one every employee signs. The company had the lawful right to review it, and I was the company. Detective Salazar walked me through it, and then he brought it to an active duty colleague, because Hector was retired and this needed to be real. And within about 3 days there was a detective on the force and an assistant district attorney looking at a picture that was getting clearer by the morning, because I kept driving him. That was my job now, and it was the hardest job I've ever done. Every morning at 7:15 I pulled up outside Julian's building and he got in the back, and I said, "Morning," to the mirror, and he planned my daughter's death in a car that was recording every word with his lawful, signed, forgotten consent, and I drove him downtown and said, "Have a good one," and I went home and I was sick, and I did it again the next day. 23 days. I want you to understand what it costs to say "morning" pleasantly to a man you have heard planning to murder your child, and to do it again and again, because the case isn't ready, because Salazar says, "Not yet, Emmett, one more, we need the other voice." There was one morning I nearly lost it. About 2 weeks in. Julian got in the back and he was in a good mood, and he made small talk with me, he almost never did, and what he said was, "Big weekend coming up, getting married." And I said, to the mirror, "Congratulations." And he said, "Yeah, she's a great girl, you'd like her." And he was looking at his phone when he said it, and there was a little smile in his voice, the warm, catalog voice, and I understood that. He was practicing. He was trying the devoted fiancé voice out loud, on the furniture, tuning it, the way you'd rehearse a toast. He was using my daughter's murder as a chance to warm up his grieving husband performance on a man he thought was no one. I had both hands on the wheel, and I looked at the back of his head in the mirror, and for about 3 seconds I understood, in my body, every man who has ever done the thing I had promised Salazar I would not do. My foot was very still on the brake. And then I thought about Nora in that conference room that didn't exist yet. Safe, alive, because I said the right word now, and I said, "She's a lucky girl." And I drove him downtown. Salazar called me that night because he'd heard it on the pull from the car, and he didn't say "good job." He said, "That was the hardest one, they get easier now." He was right, and I've never forgotten that he knew, from a recording, exactly what that morning had cost me. The other voice, the woman. Because a plan like this is a conspiracy, and a conspiracy has at least 2 people in it, and the strongest case, the one that doesn't rely only on Julian's words, the one that shows this was real and moving and not a sick man talking to himself, needed the person on the other end of that phone. And over those 3 weeks, in the back of my car, Julian gave her to me. Her name was Sloane. She wasn't a hired killer. That's what I'd braced for, some faceless professional. It was worse, and it was sadder, and it was more human than that. Sloane was the woman Julian actually loved. Or wanted, at least. I don't know if a man like that loves. They'd been together, on and off, since before he ever met my daughter. She was the register I'd heard under his voice for 6 months. The one that wasn't the client voice or the furniture voice. The real one. Here was the whole shape of it, and it came out over those weeks in pieces, and Salazar's people filled the rest from the phone and email records the company lawfully pulled. Julian was drowning in debt. Some of it gambling. Some of it just the arithmetic of a man who has to look like he has money he doesn't. He'd met Nora, and Nora was lovely, and Nora was successful, and Nora had a father who'd built a freight company, and Julian had done the math that men like him do, which is that the fastest route to $8 million is not to earn it. The plan was patient, which is what made it monstrous. Marry Nora. Be the perfect husband for a year, maybe 2, long enough that no one would ever question the devotion. Somewhere in the first months of the marriage, as part of responsible newlywed financial planning, have her take out a life insurance policy, the kind couples are told they should have, and make it substantial, and name him the beneficiary, and have her sign it the way people sign the stack of papers a confident spouse puts in front of them. And then, after enough time had passed, an accident, something clean, a hiking trip, a road at night, a grieving widower, $8 million, and Sloane, who'd waited, and who no one had ever connected to any of it, because who would suspect the devastated young man's old girlfriend from years ago? Nora was, in Julian's own words, exactly what it needed to look like. I had to hear all of that, in pieces, in the mirror, over 23 mornings, and say, have a good one. The detective told me later that in his career he'd worked a handful of these, the insurance motive spousal cases, and that the thing people don't understand is how ordinary the planning sounds. There's no snarling. It's logistics. It's two people who've decided a third person is a line item, discussing timing and paperwork the way you'd discuss a kitchen renovation. That's the part that gets into you, not the malice, the calm. By the 21st day, the assistant district attorney had what she needed. The car's recordings, lawful, consented, owned by the company. The phone and email records, lawful, monitoring policy, owned by the company. Julian's voice and Sloane's voice, over weeks, building a plan with a date and a dollar figure and a method and a beneficiary. Two people, a conspiracy, substantial steps taken. Sloane had already gotten insurance quotes, which is a step, which is the thing that turns a sick fantasy into a chargeable crime. They set the arrest for the 9th of July, 2 days before the wedding. And there was one thing left that I had to do, and it was worse than the 23 mornings, and it was the only part of this I could not delegate to any detective or lawyer on earth. I had to tell Nora. Salazar told me how to do it, and thank God, because I'd have done it wrong. He said, not on the phone, not at her place where the memories of Julian are in every room. Somewhere neutral, somewhere safe, with the right people already there, and you don't argue with her, and you don't ask her to believe you. You let her hear it herself. You put it in front of her, and you let the evidence do what your words never could. So it wasn't me alone breaking my daughter's heart in a kitchen. It was a conference room in my lawyer Naomi Frankel's office on the 8th of July, the day before the arrest, the evening before the day before her wedding. Nora, me, Naomi, and Detective Salazar, who my daughter had never met, and who introduced himself gently and told her he was there to help. Nora sat down confused and a little scared. I'd told her only that something serious had come up and that I needed her, and she came, because we're us. Because when her father says he needs her, she comes the way I came when she was small. I'm not going to tell you everything that was said in that room. Some of it belongs to my daughter and not to the internet. But I'll tell you the shape of it. I said, Nora, I have to show you something, and it's going to be the worst thing you've ever heard, and I need you to know before I start that you did nothing wrong, and that I love you, and that every person in this room is on your side. And then Naomi, very quietly, played about 90 seconds of audio. It was Julian's voice. In my car, and it was the 17th of June, and it was, after the wedding, she has an accident, something clean, and the insurance is $8 million, and it was more after that. The parts I hadn't told my daughter, the parts about Sloane, the parts where he called her, Nora, exactly what it needs to look like. I watched my daughter's face while her own life came apart, and I will see it until I die. She didn't cry at first, that's not how it goes. First, there's the thing where the mind refuses it. She actually said, that's edited, that's not what it sounds like. And Salazar gently said, I understand, listen to the next part, and played more. And there's a moment, a specific terrible moment, when a person stops being able to not believe it. I saw it cross her face. The exact second the swap stopped working, the same swap I'd done for months, the mind finally out of smaller explanations. And then my 29-year-old daughter, who designs hospital hallways so that frightened people can see something kind from where they're sitting, put her face in her hands and made a sound I had never heard her make and hope I never hear again. I held her. Salazar and Naomi stepped out and gave us the room. And I held my girl while she shook, and I said the only true thing there was, which was, I've got you, you're safe, I've got you. Over and over, the way you do, because there aren't any other words and there don't need to be. She said into my shoulder, "How long have you known?" And I told her the truth. 3 weeks. And I told her why I hadn't come to her sooner, that if she'd confronted him, he'd have run, or worse, and I watched her understand it, watched the architect in her follow the load path of it, and see that the structure only held if I'd done it exactly the way I did. And she said something I'll carry as long as I carry her face. She said, "You drove him." Every morning, knowing. You drove him to work and said good morning so that I could be sitting in this room instead of... And she couldn't finish it, and she didn't have to. They arrested Julian Rask on the 9th of July at 7:15 in the morning. I know the time because I was there. Salazar didn't want me there, and I told him I had earned this one thing, and he looked at me for a while, and then he said, "In the car. You stay in the car. You do not get out no matter what. If you get out, his lawyer has something. Give me your word." And I gave him my word, and I have kept every word I gave that man. So I did the last morning the way I'd done all the others. I was at the curb outside his building at 7:15, and he came out in his good coat on his phone, of course on his phone, and he opened the back door and he got in, and he said, "Morning," toward the front of the car, and he did not look at me, on the last morning as on the first, and I pulled away from the curb, and 2 blocks later, where Salazar had said it, there were the cars. I stopped. Julian looked up from his phone, mildly annoyed, the way you look up at any small delay, and he said, "What's going on?" I shifted into park, and for the first time in 6 months, I turned all the way around in my seat, and I looked my daughter's fiancé full in the face, and I let him see me. Really see me. And I watched him not understand, and then start to understand, and then understand completely. I said, "Good morning, Julian. My name is Emmett Boswell. I own Cardinal Freight Lines. I own this car. I own the building you've been walking into every morning for a year, and I'm Nora's father. I have waited my whole life to watch a specific thing happen to a specific face, and I got to watch it once, and once was enough." He said, and this is the truest thing about him, it's the only thing he had left, he said, "You're the driver." Like it was impossible. Like the universe had cheated. Like the one thing that could not be, because he had built his entire life on the certainty that the man in the front seat did not count, was that the man in the front seat counted more than anyone. And I said, "I've been the driver the whole time. You just never looked." Then the detectives opened his door, and they said his name, and they told him he was under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, and they read him his rights, and Julian Rask was taken out of the back of my car in handcuffs on the morning of what should have been 2 days before his wedding, and I sat in the front seat and I watched it in the mirror I'd watched him in for 6 months, and I did not feel what I thought I'd feel. I thought I'd feel triumph. I didn't. I felt tired, and I felt sad for my daughter, and underneath both of those I felt something quieter and steadier that I've decided was this. A man had looked at the world and decided that certain people didn't matter, and the world had answered him, and I got to be the answer. Not with my fists, with my patience, with the exact thing he was too small to imagine, that the person beneath his notice was a whole person, with a daughter, and a company, and a very good memory and nothing to prove. Sloane was arrested the same morning, across town, at almost the same minute. She'd gotten the insurance quotes on her own laptop. That was the step that turned it real. She never saw it coming either. Here's what's happened since. It's been a few weeks, and it isn't tidy, because real things aren't. Julian and Sloane are both charged with conspiracy to commit murder. They're being held. There's a long road of hearings ahead, and I've been told to prepare for it to take a year or more, and I'll be at every date, and so will the recordings from my car, which are lawful and clean, and were reviewed 6 ways by people whose job is to make sure a man like Julian doesn't wriggle out on a technicality that a furious father would have handed him. Julian has a good lawyer. Good lawyers don't beat their own client's voice, on tape, with consent, planning it with a co-conspirator who took steps. His voice is the wall he's going to break himself against. The wedding didn't happen, obviously. The 11th of July came and went. Some of Nora's friends had flown in before we could reach all of them. And instead of a wedding, they sat in my living room with my daughter. and a couple of them are the kind of friends who don't need to be told twice whose side to be on, and they closed around her, and I was grateful in a way I couldn't say. Nora is staying with me. Her old room. Some nights she doesn't sleep and I hear her moving around the house at 2 in the morning, and sometimes I get up and we sit in the kitchen and don't talk, and sometimes I let her be, because grief needs both. She's seeing a counselor Salazar recommended, one who specializes in this specific kind of wound. The discovery that the person closest to you was, the whole time, someone you never met. That's the part she's fighting through now, and it's the cruelest part, and it's got nothing to do with the $8 million. It's that Julian was warm to her. Genuinely, convincingly, every day for 2 years. He remembered her anniversaries and brought her mother flowers and held her when she cried, and it was the same practiced warm face he gave the waiter before turning around. A face with a cold thing behind it and no seam between. And she has to live now with the knowledge that she could not tell the difference. Nobody could. I couldn't, for months, and I was watching for it on purpose. She said to me last week at the kitchen table, "How am I ever supposed to trust anyone again if I couldn't see that?" And I didn't have a clean answer because there isn't one, but I told her the truest thing I know, which I'll give to you in a minute, because it's the whole reason I'm telling this at all. The $8 million, by the way, the policy Julian was going to have her sign after the wedding, was never taken out. That's worth saying plainly, because people ask. There's no policy. The number was his target, spoken on a phone in my car. It was never a document because we stopped it in the planning. Before the wedding. Before the signing. Before any of it could be built. That's what Before the Wedding bought. Not revenge on a completed crime, the prevention of one. He never got $1. He never got my daughter. He got a cell and a court date and the specific permanent knowledge, which I hope visits him at night, that the man he'd decided was furniture was the one who ended him. I told you I'd tell you the thing I got wrong. Here it is, and it's not comfortable. I almost missed it. Not out of carelessness. I was watching that man harder than I've watched anyone in my life. I put myself behind the wheel for 6 months specifically to catch who he really was, and I still spent months hearing exactly what it needs to look like. And after July it's handled, and turning them into a smaller, survivable story. That he was a social climber, that he was using her, that he was merely bad instead of monstrous. Why? Because I love my daughter, and the true explanation was that a man was going to murder my child, and no father's mind will hold that when a lesser explanation is available. The mind reaches for the version you can survive. Everybody's does. That's not a flaw in me or in you. It's the specific mechanism these people rely on. They don't hide the truth. They count on the fact that the truth is too large for the people who love you to pick up, so those people will keep setting it down and choosing something smaller. So here's what I want you to take from an old man who nearly learned this too late. When something about a person you love feels wrong, really wrong, a cold water feeling, not a preference, not a personality clash, do not do what I did and spend months trading the real explanation for a bearable one. Do not keep filing the small cruel things under, well, everybody's got a flaw. Look at the whole stack at once. Ask the unthinkable question out loud, even just to yourself, even though it feels insane, because the feeling that it's insane to think it is the exact feeling these men are banking on, and the other thing, the bigger one, the one that turned out to be the whole story. Watch how people treat the person who can do nothing for them. Not how they treat you. Not how they treat your daughter when she's being courted, or their boss, or anyone worth impressing. Everybody performs uphill. You learn nothing watching a man be charming to someone he wants something from. You learn everything watching how he treats the waiter after the waiter turns around, the old woman at the register, the guy fueling the trucks, the driver he's decided is furniture. Because the contempt a person shows to the people they think don't matter, that is the true face. The warm one is the mask. Julian showed me his true face in the first month, over a spilled glass of water, and it took me a while to trust what I'd seen, and everything after that was just him showing it to me again, morning after morning, to a man he'd decided didn't count. His contempt for the invisible was not a small character flaw. It was the whole man. It was the thing that let him plan to erase a person for money, and it was the thing that blinded him to the one person who could stop him, and in the end, it was the exact instrument of his ruin. He could not conceive that the driver mattered. That is why the driver was able to save my daughter's life. One more thing, and then I'll let you go. A few days ago, Nora asked if she could come with me to the yard, the truck yard. She hadn't been down there since. She was a girl, back when I'd bring her on a Saturday and let her sit up in a cab and pretend to drive and blow the horn until the whole lot was sick of it. So I took her, and we walked through the yard, and I introduced her to the men and women who fuel the trucks and load the docks and drive the long routes. The people whose names I know because I was one of them, and never stopped being one of them. And I watched my daughter, hollowed out, exhausted, months of pain still ahead of her. I watched her shake every one of those hands and look every one of those people in the eye and thank them, by name, for their work. And I thought, there she is. There's the difference, standing in a truck yard. Because that's the tell. That was always the tell. Julian looked at a driver and saw furniture. My daughter looks at a driver and sees a person. And the whole catastrophe of the last 2 years, and the whole of who these two people actually are, is right there in that one difference. And I should have trusted from the very beginning that a woman who sees people could not, in the end, be fooled forever by a man who doesn't. Even if it took the man's own contempt, and her father behind the wheel, to bring it into the light. She's going to be all right, not soon, but she is. I know it because of how she was in that yard. So here's my question, and I read every one. Think about the last time you watched someone treat a nobody like they were furniture. A server, a driver, an older worker, someone who could do nothing for them. And think about how quickly you explained it away, or laughed along, or told yourself it didn't mean anything. It means everything. It's the most reliable thing there is. Tell me in the comments about a time the way someone treated an invisible person told you exactly who they were before you were ready to know it. You don't have to name anybody, just tell me you saw it. Because somebody watching tonight is explaining away a cold water feeling right now, and your comment might be the thing that finally makes them stop trading the real explanation for a smaller one. And if this reached you, if you've ever been the person nobody looks at, or if you want to be the kind of person who looks, then subscribe. I'll be here. You know by now who I make these for. And if you live long enough, that's every single one of us. For 6 months, I drove my daughter's fiancé to work, and he never once looked at my face. It's the most expensive mistake I've ever watched a man make. Look at the driver.